Hi everyone, I'm Soma and this is David Buckland. He has been a long time explorer of cosmic consciousness. He has an MA in Vedic science as well as PhD in Vedic science and spiritual development. Hi David, thank you for this opportunity.
Well, thank you for the invite.
I've been reading your book. It's really rare content to find about, especially something that talks about what happens after an awakening. So thank you for writing that book.
Oh, you're welcome. It was, I could see the need was out there. A lot of people understood the initial shift itself, but the understanding of the larger process and what can take place after that was not widely understood. There was a lot of concepts that had been spoken about, but concepts are not living. And when we're actually living it, you know, how is that experienced in this or that life or this or that physiology? There's a lot of variation, and it's important to understand the fundamentals that are behind it, and then the variations that can take place on top of that. So essentially, it talks about the stages of enlightenment.
Yeah, I definitely want to discuss like in the order that you have discussed it in the book. But before that, I would love to know how you got started with your own explorations and how that shift unfolded in your story.
Okay. Well, I guess in a nutshell, in my late teens, I was reading some material about some books about the brain functioning. They would talk about right brain, left brain kinds of things and so on. And of course, that led to the topic of consciousness. And then that led to the topic of meditation, which I didn't know anything at all about. And so I ended up going to a talk on Transcendental Meditation, TM, and they presented some research there that had been done on the benefits and so on. And so out of curiosity, mainly, I decided to give it a try. And to my surprise, it was this whole other thing. My very first meditation and dropping into this deep peace and you know, inner light and so on like that. So it was like, whoa. And so I became quite into it, and a regular meditator. I went to talks and court classes and so on like that. And about 9 months after I learned TM, I went to Europe and to study to teach it. And mainly my motivation was to learn more, because that was how you learn more about the Vedic tradition and the philosophical backdrop to meditation. And so after the actually after about 3 months of the course, I did a lot of purification the first 3 months. And then about 3 months in, I started having brief periods of witnessing. And witnessing is when you shift from experiencing yourself as a person here to stepping back into being a kind of observer, a detached witness to day-to-day activities. Your body and your mind and emotions and stuff all continue to act as before, but now you're not in them. You're kind of a step behind them. Now, in some cases, that arises with awakening, but sometimes, as in my case, it's a kind of a halfway, not quite awake. Consciousness itself has become awake, but it hasn't become awake to itself. Not the actual awakening shift. So it was kind of like a partial. So there was still an identified ego along with this witness value. So that sometimes fall into the ego and sometimes be more in the witness. And that's basically that awakeness continued thereafter. One of the key signs of a witness is this continuity. With the ego is a function of the mind. And when the mind goes to sleep at night, the ego goes offline, and then it wakes up in the morning. Sometimes when you wake up in the morning, there can be a moment where you're kind of just beginning to wake up, and suddenly the ego kicks in, and so you can notice that shift. Maybe that's more obvious when you're witnessing, but there's a sense of awakeness, which can be prominent or very quiet. dependent, but there's primarily this sense of continuity throughout waking, dreaming, and sleeping. It never stops. And sometimes there can be, there's awakeness during, like you can be aware of your body falling asleep and the mind going to sleep and so on, and settling into just quiet consciousness. When the mind is asleep, there's no experience because the mind is the processor of the senses. So it just goes very silent, like a deep meditation all night. And after a short while of that on the retreat, then it kind of the lights came on, so to speak. The Kundalini tradition refers to it as a makara. It's kind of this point just above the third eye, where once the Kundalini reaches that point, it becomes stable. It doesn't go up and down anymore, and the witness stays online. There's only a short distance between that and the crown and awakening, but in my case, there was a long period of time between that, before that step, as that tradition talks about. Sometimes it can pause there to wait for the physiology to catch up, and do some more purification and karma, deal with some karma and so on. So in my case, the lights came on and I had my first cognition. A cognition is kind of a type of experience where it's like everything all at once, kind of like it's a big download. So whatever it is you're experiencing, you know it completely, like all sides of it, the inside, the outside, the back of it, its whole history and origins and all at once. And then it takes a whole long time for the mind to digest that, so you can give it words and relate to it a little bit. In this case, it was the experiencing the universe from the outside and how it comes to be in its structure and so on like that. So as I say, that kind of continued for a long time after the course, trying to sort out what it was I discovered and seeing it different ways and that. At the end of the course, I spoke with Maharishi and Mahesh Yogi, and he said there would be much more, which was kind of an understatement. But after that, I came back into the day-to-day life. I tried teaching meditation for a little bit. Excuse me. But I couldn't really support myself that way. And so I shifted into more of a career orientation and got married, and we started a family and all those sort of very relative sorts of things. So spirituality gradually faded into the background. I continued to meditate and things continued to unfold in various ways, but it was more in the background. There was much less time to think about those things. And that went on for quite a while. And then about 2005, the life I was living all kind of just fell apart. Things that have been going on. It's just like there was a chapter ended, essentially, a page turned, and so in the process of that transition, the life that I'd been living ended, and a whole different scenario flowered. And a short time later, I reconnected with some old friends from my old TM days, and spirituality moved to the forefront again. And then I met Lauren Hoff and his wife Lucia, and basically listening to him on a conference call, it was kind of the catalyst. And then self, that had been awake all that time, woke up to itself. So there was that shift from experiencing consciousness to being it fully. And then I'm assuming because of the long time witnessing, that the ground was well prepared. So the shift was very clear, and the next shifts in the stages of consciousness came quite quickly. Next couple of shifts, and then it gradually slowed down as the need to catch up more and integrate and so on happened. And it was an interesting change in my life in a practical way too, because I had been working in IT and managing software development and online application management system and so on. And I sort of made it, to support myself. I had this assumption that that was the kind of work that I do, and so it took a little while to recognize that that was just not supported anymore. I did some consulting for a little bit, but a lot of I had to get a lot of smack back to really get the hint that this is not where I'm supposed to be putting my attention. And and meanwhile the writing had started, but I really didn't give the writing any weight. I didn't consider myself a writer or that I had any skill as a writer, but it was just happening spontaneously. And of course, being a little clueless, I didn't realize that that was because that was what I was supposed to be doing. And so very gradually the attention shifted more to the writing and blogging initially, and I started working on a book after I woke up, and then that was just kind of like a big knowledge dump. It's like I wrote this massive book, but it was way too much information, it was too concentrated. It had to be opened up and explained a lot more, and it was going to be way too large. And so I broke it up into 3, and then eventually took one chapter and turned that into the first book. And now I'm working on 2 others. One of them coming off of a dissertation I did last spring, and the other a translation of the Yoga Sutra, and commentary, just to understand that whole thing properly, because yoga is essentially the means of preparing the ground so that those stages of enlightenment can flower.
If you had to, and I know this is very difficult to put it in words, but if you had to describe the self-realization, how the self was realized, and what was seen, how do you describe it?
Well, it's not a perceptual thing or an experience. It's a shift in being, and so it's kind of it's like a shift in perspective. And so, like before, when you're kind of in the ego, you're kind of in the body mind, and you're experiencing as being a me, and life is happening to me, and I am doing, and so on. And then with the witness, you kind of take a step back and you're observing. And then with in my case, with the self-realization or cosmic consciousness step, it's like taking a still further step back. The witness is kind of like what's known as a jiva witness. Essentially, it's what we might call in the West the soul, or it's the point value of consciousness that's doing the witnessing. Whereas with awakening, you step back into the ocean, and you experience yourself here as a wave of the ocean, but you're the self, the cosmic self that you wake up to. Well, you don't wake up to it; it wakes up to itself, but you experience through this point, through as a kind of a wave of consciousness. So you become the ocean at that point. So there's kind of a sense of being infinite and eternal. And one of the funny parts of waking up too is how normal and ordinary it is. A lot of people expect it to be some big flashy thing, and yet one of the first impressions a lot of people get is like, how did I not get this years ago? This is so simple. It's the simplest thing. How did I not figure this out? Of course, it's nothing you can figure out because it's not the mind that does it, or the person that wakes. It's not that's a key point. Again, it's not the person that wakes up. No one will ever wake up, because it's the self that's waking up to itself through the apparent person, through the expression that we refer to as a person. And so those human values, our thoughts and emotions and sensations and our life, that still remains. What changes is our perspective of that. We're not as caught in it. We make better choices. There's a deep grounding in peace, and if there's enough clarity in bliss, becomes kind of a background or sometimes foreground, but quality to life. And so it's a major upgrade in quality of life. but it's not a goal in itself any more than like when you're a preteen, you might have a goal of being a teenager, but being a teenager isn't really a goal in itself. It's just a style of living, you could say, a perspective of from which you experience your life, and it's the same with awakening. It's a nice upgrade, but it's a way of living life. It's not a thing in itself. If that makes any sense. Yeah,
And you have
it's like we become an architect to do architecture, not to sit and say, I'm an architect. You know, it doesn't really mean anything if you don't actually do it.
and you have talked about how there are two sides of self-realization. Like in some cases, it's like a switch. But in other cases, it may not be like an instant thing. It may be.
Yeah, the underlying process is the same for everybody. That shift in being. I sometimes give the example of puberty. It's the same process for everybody, but how you experience it individually varies, widely. And there's kind of, I think, 5 styles I've noted from what I've seen of people waking up. There can be a sense of, for example, an ego death and shift into cosmic being. There can be a sense of ego death into a no self, where the infinite, eternal qualities of consciousness are less expressed. It's a more unmanifest value, and the infinite consciousness is experienced more as an emptiness, whereas in the first example, it's experienced more as a fullness. Same thing, but just experienced in a somewhat different way. There's people who have a devotional surrender. It's a form of surrender, a letting go, in any case, but with a devotional shift, that tends to be more prominent. There can be the sense of shift from being a personal, local me to being a cosmic me, like an expansion. Instead of a letting go, it feels more like an expansion. And then there's what I jokingly call the oozers, the people that have a more gradual shift. The shift itself happens in just a fraction of a second. It's just this recognition of the self by itself. But how clear that is to the person varies widely. So for some, there's like a really clear shift, and there's the change in perspective. But for others, there can be an opening, and then some falling back into mind for a time, and some further purification. There's usually a fair bit of unwinding afterwards, because it's sort of like when you wake up, it's like you're now meditating 24/7, because you're always in the transcendent, so it's always there. And of course, it's the degree varies, but there can tend to be a lot of unpacking. Adyashanti has an excellent book on that topic called "The End of Your World," which talks about that process of unpacking in the period after awakening. It's not that should sound scary at all. It's the same old stuff. It's just now it can happen more rapidly, and because you're not attached anymore, it's smoother, and it just clears readily. I should note here, though, that this sense of ego death it's an interesting one. I experienced it myself, but it's not that the ego actually dies. It's that the attachment to the ego is what ends. The ego as a function remains, but it's no longer we no longer experience it as who we are. It's kind of like we have a thumb, and that doesn't fall off when we wake up, and the function of the ego is still there. Like, we still need to be able to differentiate. This is my thumb, and it's not the carrot when I'm cutting, or that this is my foot and that's the floor. You need to be clear on where the floor is when you're walking. If you ever had a leg go to sleep, or go to step when there isn't a step, or vice versa, think there isn't a step and there is. That kind of that function still needs to be there. We need to be able to distinguish ourselves from other on a physical level to interact with the world. But as a sense of who we are, that's gone. That attachment is gone. Sometimes the texts distinguish layers of that. Essentially, that ego comes up initially in the separation from the mother when we're very young. We need to distinguish ourselves from mother to become a functioning entity. And then around the age of the terrible twos, as they call it, around age 2, then the possessive self comes online. The first is ahamkara, the I sense, and the second is asmita, the my sense, the possessive self. And that's where you see a child mine, and they get this strong sense of possessiveness. Now, in a full-fledged development, we outgrow those. That's at a certain point. But in the vast cycles of time, there's kind of rising and falling collective consciousness, and we're kind of rising out of a darker period, and that understanding, a lot of this understanding has been lost and is now being revived, and so there's a beautiful flowering going on, and many people waking up, and then going through advanced stages as well, more advanced progress. And it's all really a natural part of our growth and development, if we have the right elements in our life. As psychology has studied, that most adults tend to get stuck partway up the scale of the standard understanding of ego development. They get kind of identified at a certain point, and that stalls their development. Whereas if you have a practice that gives you regular experience of your inner nature in consciousness, those attachments soften, and we start to get, prepare the ground basically for shifts to take place. And then at some point, the right time comes up, and there's a shift from this kind of a confluence of things that comes up, and then the shift happens. Now, it's useful to note here that there are occasional people who just wake up all by them, Byron Katie or Eckhart Tolle, for example, just kind of spontaneously. Well, those actually are probably poor examples, because both of them had basically an ego collapse, which is what led to their awakening. So that's doing it the hard way. But there's other examples where people just spontaneously woke up. But usually, for most people, there's a catalyst. Basically, someone who's already awake is an example, because none of us in our however many past lives we've had have ever awoken. So we have no experiential reference for it, even though it's a profoundly simple thing. There's no how-to in our memory, and so the exposure to when we do spiritual practices and prepare the ground, we become ripe for the shift. Then the catalyst of someone awake can be very valuable through satsang or retreat or whatever like that, as that can catalyze the shift. And I've seen that many times. They just need the right exposure at the right time, and the shift happens. And it's not that the teacher or awake person causes the shift. It's just they kind of they're a living example of it. And so the self in them speaks to the self in you, and it's the same self. So it's the same self waking up, and that becomes really clear too, because if you're nearby somebody who's waking up, they are the same self as you, and so it's you waking up in another form. And it's kind of almost like a shared experience in a kind of way. So I've been really pleased to enjoy many shifts of that way, and all these different flavors of emotional surrender or big release or however it shows up, less stress, and yeah, it's such a beautiful thing, and it's kind of, it creates a deep kind of connection with somebody too when you wake up together, or you have awakening with someone, because then it's a shared experience on a very intimate level.
And it seems like in some cases, even when that realization has happened, it may still not be clear. A person may still carry some of the concepts from their teacher, or
Yeah, there can be a number of things. It can be very clear, but then the mind tries to figure it out and creates doubt. And they're kind of sort of like inner conflict until there's I don't know, trust isn't the right word, but till there's confidence. So the person isn't fighting it at all. There's an example. This woman wrote a book about her shift. She woke up, but it didn't meet her concepts. She was just getting on a bus and woke up spontaneously, but it didn't meet her concepts about it, and she actually fought it for 10 years. Refused to accept it. People told her she was awake. she got into this whole internal conflict, and finally she finally surrendered and let that identification with the ego go, so that it could live through her properly. And then she rapidly had her second shift. There's also another major factor in the way that process is experienced is what's often called the masculine and the feminine processes, and that they're true in everybody. The masculine is essentially the consciousness part. The part of consciousness waking up to itself, which is key in that first shift. But then that's lived in our life. And there's all these layers between the physical world and consciousness. Excuse me. And the feminine is the expression, the active side of consciousness, the Shakti, the expression, the nature. And so there's this process of the awakening heart and the refinement of perception that brings out all that the middle range of, between the surface and our inner nature. And again, practices like meditation are good because to get to consciousness, you transcend down through those layers, and then gradually helps clear and purify them. Although I have found that in many cases it can be useful to do some supplementary work, because we can have these deeply entrenched habits of resistance around some of our larger knots or nuts, so they're referred to in different ways, where we can soften them a bit in meditation and then reinforce them when we get back into activity. And so becoming more conscious of our energy dynamics and learning to allow and let go. So a lot of karma, what people call karma, is essentially unfinished business. It's experiences that didn't fully complete. And when we wake up, one of the beautiful things that happens is resistance falls away. Sometimes it can take a little time, and it can be faster in some areas of life than others. Like if we've had more trauma around relationships, then maybe that area will take a little more time to heal. But gradually that falls away, and then when old issues come to the surface to be healed, we can simply experience them, and they complete, and they're done. Whereas historically, there's the tendency for something to come up and say, "Oh, that's unpleasant. Don't want that." To push it back down again. And if it gets more insistent, then we kind of push harder and create more kind of crusts and layers of resistance. But all that resistance and all that compacting and stuff takes energy to maintain. So when we start to release all this old junk and clean out our closet, so to speak, it's like it can be like taking a load off over time that we've been carrying around, but it also frees up a whole lot of energy that we've been used to keep a lid on it, and that's released. So it's a matter of becoming more conscious of our inner dynamics and how we're responding to life, and shifting those a little bit gradually. And there can be little things, like one of the magic things for me shortly before I woke up was gratitude. I realized there were some emotional habits of grumbling, essentially, grumbling at life. Oh, this happened. And I saw a talk about carrying around a little gratitude rock in your pocket. And when you notice the rock, you think of something different to be grateful for. And when you take it out in the take it off, put it in your pocket in the morning, and you take it out at the end of the day, and so on. And it just, I thought that was good. Not in making a mood, like, oh, I'm happy, oh, I feel gratitude. You can kind of, because the mind can, that's one of the things you have to be really clear on. The mind is good for thinking, and it can be aware of, and it can name emotions, but it can't process emotions. It can't experience emotions. That's not its job. Its job is to experience thoughts and to name things. But to actually process emotions, you have to drop into the emotional body, or the energy body, however you want to frame it, and experience on that way. So when you kind of sit there and have a concept of, oh, I have gratitude, or I feel gratitude, and it's in the mind, it's just the mind. It's making a mood, or being creative isn't quite the right word, but it's making it up. But to actually feel gratitude, that kind of shifts the tone. And there's always things to be grateful for. Sure, life has challenges, but there's always good things to be grateful for. I mean, heck, if we live in North America, or Europe, or places like that, we're automatically in the top percent of the potential quality of life we have. Even someone poor in North America is doing better than people in many parts of the world. So there's lots to be grateful for. And or the fact that we can listen to a conversation like this, and the opportunity to do that. It wasn't there when I was younger. And so there's just that shift in attention. It tends to, over time, it takes a bit of time, but over time it kind of shifts the overall tone and the habit of how what kind of energy we're culturing. Because the energy we're culturing is kind of what creates a kind of overall tone, which we're not necessarily conscious of this, but other people respond to because they feel us, maybe not consciously, but we go to see somebody, they'll if they know us well, they'll kind of know if we're feeling a little off or whatever. They'll have a sense of that, even if we're in denial, but we're actually broadcasting how we are all the time, energetically, and some people are aware of that, but a lot of people are not, simply because we don't tend to culture that in our culture. But it's actually not all that hard to learn, and it's not all that hard to culture better habits, and then we kind of create habits that eventually will wash away the old grooves of being grumbly about life, and then that place of acceptance allows letting go, allows us to be with whatever is here, however it's showing up, and process that. And it's really fascinating to watch how life shifts with those changes, because there's kind of this momentum that we create by the tone of how we deal with life. And if we have a habit, and this isn't to say we should blame ourselves if we grumble a lot. It's just habit, and it's good to do something about this being self-incriminating or whatever is just another kind of grumble, really. And so you just shift the habits away from that and towards more positivity. And I'm not again, positive thinking has its value on a certain level, but positive feeling has a bigger value, because energy is something we share more, and it has a long-term impact on what we allow in our life, what we find acceptable, what we're willing to be with. Anyways, don't want to get into a big lecture or anything.
When some of these speakers in non-dualism, when they talk about world is an illusion, does that resonate with you?
Okay, that's something that's become a little misunderstood. The sage Shankara, Adi Shankara, was the one that revived the monastic tradition in India. It had been pretty much lost at a certain point in Indian life. And he revived the monastic tradition and the advaita, the philosophy of non-duality. And one of the things he talked about, there's what are called the gunas. There essentially means quality. There's these three fundamental qualities that essentially of consciousness that give things their basic nature at a really fundamental layer. And they're basically tamas, which essentially means inertia, or something that gives something its mass, oomph, solidity. The quality of the guna of rajas, which is essentially is movement or fire, or it's a transformation. And then you've got sattva, which is clarity or purity. And essentially, there's this process in consciousness that migrates between tamas and sattva through rajas. Rajas transforms inertia into clarity, and clarity into inertia, depending on like the emotional tone we're culturing. Cultures our overall tone. And so we kind of tend to have a dominant guna in our experience. And the vast majority of people out there have dominant tamas. They have very physical bodies and are very much in the world and a form, and experience themselves as a body, mind, and so on. And so that dominant tamas makes the external world seem real. But as we go through a spiritual process and practices, there's a transformation that takes place, and rajas becomes more prominent. When rajas is very prominent, we can experience the world as illusory. So it's a quality of who we are, our dominant quality in our physiology. We all have a mixture. They're all always present together, but it's the dominant blend. And then as we progress further in the spiritual process, then sattva becomes dominant, and then we experience the world as the divine play, as lila. So world as illusion is a valid experience on the spiritual path, but it's not reality. It's a perspective of reality. And then there's a further later stage associated with Brahman, where the world is experienced as never having been created in the first place. It's not even an illusion, it was never created. And yet here it is. And that Brahman is profoundly challenging to talk about, because it's a collapse of all the dualities. It's a true non-dual kind of state. But it's almost impossible to describe, because even conscious, no conscious, existing, no existing are all collapsed together. And that's kind of getting way off. There's a whole bunch of things that have to be explained to explain that properly before that. But there are those stages of experience. And then beyond that is a still further stage where the source of the source, so to speak, it becomes known. And we come to understand the whole mechanism, and why three qualities, and why this and that, and so on. But again, there's a whole other conversation to go through the whole process. But the key to understand is where we are points in universal consciousness. We're points of experiencing from here, and we're here to experience life from a specific perspective. It's like consciousness knows itself globally, but to know all the details, it has to step into every point and experience from infinite perspectives, essentially. And so we're one of those points, experiencing it from a specific perspective, which is going to be different from all the other perspectives. And that's our role here, is to have our own unique experience of life. But it's very advantageous if we can raise the perspective of that to a higher stage, and so we're not suffering or struggling to live life in the process. And so that's where spiritual practice can be really valuable. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I'm noticing that when we try to bring up these further stages of liberation in Advaita circle, it usually gets looked at as if like like this is again a concept created by the mind, and
Yes.
it's a means
Well,
to.
the sages are have an origin in the sage Vasishta in India, and Shankara is in that same lineage. Shankara knew about it. They're mentioned in the Yoga Sutra, the foundational text of yoga. Now, there are certainly very awake teachers out there who have said there's only one stage, because was their experience. And there are teachers out there who don't talk about stages, not because they're not there, but because they think it'll create concepts in people's minds. And it's true. Talking about stages, I mean, one of the first things I had to do when I actually woke up was to throw out all my concepts about it, because although what my teacher said was accurate, how my mind had understood that was kind of a bit being, and so I had to throw that out and then bring it back again in the correct context. And so there are teachers who don't talk about it, and then there are teachers who do. But it's kind of like a map. A map can be really useful when you're traveling somewhere, and then when you get to your destination, you put it away. You don't need it. But it's important we don't confuse the map with the road. Even if we could look at Google Maps and Street View, we can go in and look at the building. That's not being there. When we actually get there, it's going to be different than we might have expected from seeing pictures or whatever. The map is not the road. So we have to keep that in mind in any model we use and any concepts we pick up from a spiritual teacher. This is about living it. And the issue with not talking about it is that people are now living it. A lot of people have woken up, and some of those have moved into further stages. I can recall having a discussion on one of the spiritual discussion boards, and people were objecting to talk of stages, and I said, well, I talked to that, and they objected to me, and then one of them in particular objected strenuously, and then about 2 months later they wrote me and apologized because another stage started to unfold. And they would have thought, if they hadn't known what they knew from objecting to what I wrote, they would have thought something was wrong. And it's an interesting thing. I was invited to speak on a panel about stages at SAND in 2012, and I didn't see the value in going there and doing that at the time, because that concept of anti-stages kind of thing was quite dominant in those circles then. However, they did do the panel. I recommended somebody else, and they were approached by several people afterwards thanking them, because there was people who thought something was wrong because their awakening seemed to be falling apart. It was becoming something else. It wasn't supposed to be there. But that stuff is there. It's not like I'm kind of coming up with my own ideas here. I am reframing it in the modern context, and I'm doing it in conjunction with speaking to many people and seeing many cases of this stuff, and refining my model as I go along, because sometimes there's concepts that this is how it appeared here, so that's how it should appear to everybody. Well, maybe not. But if you focus on what the underlying process is and you understand that, then you can see that everything else, there's all these variations for a number of reasons happen on top of that. Over time, it's changed a lot. I've spoken on stages model twice since then at Science and Non-Duality conference, and it's been very well accepted. It's evolved a lot. People are a little bit more open-minded about it. Some people are still very like, this is the teaching, this is the experience, fine. But to say that nobody else is going to have any other thing that's a bit limiting. But it's interesting too, because there's still areas that need opening up. I did do a talk a couple of years ago at SAND on the layers of becoming, how consciousness becomes the world, all those steps in between there, and that didn't go as well. And there was one person who was a bit hostile about it, but Most people were accepting, but it was just sort of like, what? Now, and that actually points again back to this masculine and feminine process. For a lot of people, you see the stages of awakening in consciousness, but there's much less refinement. And so the consciousness wakes up to itself. There needs to be enough refinement, because essentially we're experiencing through all these layers of our being into consciousness. But when consciousness becomes awake enough inside and wakes up to itself, then there's kind of a process in consciousness where it wakes up to itself within, then it wakes up to itself in the world, and then it wakes up to beyond itself. And there's kind of a process that can take place there. But that's also another one, you know. Advaita is essentially about Brahman, but people use the term Brahman to refer to the Atman and the self, because, well, there's the saying Atman is Brahman, which is actually supposed to be a recognition, not an equals to. Atman is an expression, but it's not the same as Brahman. Brahman is the great. It's so much more. But you don't get to Brahman with the first awakening. It's a later stage of development, and it's kind of ironic when people in the Advaita circles are denying Advaita and the teachings of the person who originated it, or who revived it, actually, and framed it that way. So it's an interesting dynamic, but it's a learning process. You know, I've had concepts that I thought were fully valid, and then reality came along, and I realized that, okay, that's the idea is valid, but the way I was tying it to the process isn't valid. It's more of a flexible thing. You know, for example, with the unity shift, where you recognize that consciousness underlies the world as well. It's kind of like the world is like a movie, and you recognize that I am the screen the movie is playing on, and that's the same self that's within is the screen of consciousness. And so subject and object come together into one wholeness, leaving only the process of experience, and that's known as unity consciousness. There is the ego has a kind of a three-layer structure. Earlier on, I talked about the different styles of letting go of the ego identification. That's with the head, essentially, or what Adyashanti referred to as the head. But there's also the heart level, which is the energetic drivers of the concepts of self. And then there's what's known as the gut, or the core identity, or essential identity, which is this normally very unconscious, and even in awakening, until that point that it becomes consciousness cleared. And it's kind of this core sense of, I don't know, it's like the word, like for me and others, it's like the name David is associated with that core identity. And so for me, when that let go, there was no longer a David, because what had been named David was this and of course that's very early in life as well, when that's created. And so I had associated with that with the unity shift, and Adyashanti also talks about it in those terms, but I've since realized that not necessarily. For example, a friend of mine, she had it with her Brahman shift, and sometimes it happens after Brahman. So if someone has a heart awakening, that's a good sign that the second stage is gone. And then there's kind of like this core, it's a kind of protective thing in the gut. Because the third chakra is kind of the highest personal chakra. Those three lower ones are basically about the primary physiology, and the upper ones are progressively more universal. The heart is a shared space, and the throat is essentially encompasses the universe, the fifth chakra. So it gets more and more universal. It's an interesting dynamic. I mean, you can't. One of my friends joked about the non-duality manscape, where you go into these spiritual forums, and there's all these men arguing concepts and who's right and who's smarter and or whatever, which has nothing to do with it at all, because all that is concept. This is all about living it. That's non-duality when it's lived. A philosophy, and adopting a philosophy that the world is an illusion when you experience it as solid and real, is creating a disconnect. You're adopting a philosophy that doesn't match your real experience of reality, and you're creating an inner conflict that's out of sync with reality. Do you really think that's going to cause spiritual development? Great spiritual development? No, because spiritual development is about letting go. It's letting go of our concepts, letting go of our who's right, and all those sorts of things. It's a key thing. And I'm not trying to tell anybody they're wrong. Certainly, you can have a stage. I certainly have gone through stages where I felt I knew the truth, and oh yeah, I'm right, and yeah, but it's spiritual process is one of a progressive series of openings, of realizations, of stages of development, and that's not going to happen if you're going to be holding on to something. It's and it can actually cause that holding on can cause a lot of suffering in yourself and others, and that also can create difficult karmas when you're, especially in a spiritual circle, if you're doing anything that's going to discourage somebody from their spiritual path, from their unfolding. Yeah, there can be difficult consequences of that, because that all has to balance out in the wash, so to speak.
Yeah, I've noticed that among some teachers or speakers where that realization has happened, but maybe their teacher was saying that world is illusion, and they just carried over that concept. With examining.
Yeah, but what is your experience? I mean, that's what it comes down to. What do you actually experience, and can you see through your concepts about it? I mean, I have, I mentioned earlier about throwing out some of the concepts I developed about the teaching, and there's a few places where I differ a little bit from my teacher, because I think he didn't have access to some of the things that are available now. There are resources, online resources that have made things more available, and the number of people who are waking up. That's a lot of information that wasn't there before. When you're awake and your teacher was awake, and maybe one or two other people are awake, you don't have very many resources to refer to. And it's very valid to go with your experience, but you have to be really careful about saying my experience is your experience, because that's often not the case. Most people experience the process uniquely. Same underlying process as I mentioned, but the way there's a whole bunch of factors of how for why. There's a section in the back of my book you might not have gotten to yet, where I talk about some of the dominant factors, like our dominant sense. If we're a very visual person, or we're more feeler, or we're more sound, relate more through vibration and sound, we're going to experience the process very differently. Like, I'm very visual, so there's a lot of visual stuff that's going on. If you're more, the masculine is more dominant, then there's less sensory stuff goes on. And yes, sensory stuff can be a distraction and so on. And so it's best not to chase experiences. That's another hazard a lot of people run into, where they think enlightenment is about having experiences. So they chase experiences, but experiences are all about the relative. They're all about the world of experience. Enlightenment is a shift in being. So I'm not sure if I can say it verbatim off the top of my head, but yoga is the settling of the activity of the mind. Then the user is established in their own nature, paraphrasing slightly. But so it's like it's quieting the mind. Then we can experience the silence, because pure consciousness itself is silent. We can experience our essential nature. It's not through having flashy experiences and stuff. And some people have flashy experiences, but they can be challenging. I mean, I've had a lot of experiences in my history. I touched on a little bit early on in our conversation, and some of that was very challenging because I didn't understand it in some way, or it seemed outside the model I was taught. That it wasn't supposed to happen yet, or that it didn't make sense in some way. And one of the big quandaries for me for a long time was I was having these experiences that I wasn't supposed to have until I was actually awake, and if I talked about them because of karmic influences here, it got me in trouble. I got backlash from people and stuff, and that karma, thankfully, has wound down. But and so my thought, well, so why am I having these experiences? What's the point? I can't talk about them. They don't make sense. Nobody can explain this. So it's not all um, roses and butterflies or whatever. That there's challenges to every path. And somebody else who doesn't have any experiences, they think they're not transcending because their meditations are kind of, they work hard and so they're a little tired and a little bit foggy. They think they're making no progress. I mean, I went through that period of time I mentioned where I was focused on the relative world, but when the shift, I found it quite interesting when the shift happened where spirituality became more dominant again. I realized there'd been this inner integration, and it had become much more solid is not quite the right word, but there was a lot more oomph to it than there had been before. And had been in the background, and they were just living life, clearing karma, integrating, and I was basically setting the stage for awakening without realizing it, because I was busy off in the world and doing stuff. But I was still, meditating and still doing the basics that I needed to maintain that, and gradually the process matures, and the time comes when it's time, and then grace can descend and.
And it seems like some of these unfoldings may not be like magical experiences. They could be like ordinary, simple things that unfold.
Oh yeah, they can be very ordinary. They can be very fantastic. There's just like any kind of human experience, there's a huge range of potential, and some of them can be challenging, like when you have a real hard nut, an old trauma that you've never dealt with come to the surface. It can be challenging because you want to be able to be with that and let it complete. But if it's a big one, but sometimes it's a bit of a boogeyman thing, some trauma we had as a child, we were very afraid of it. And so the first thing we're dealing with as an adult now is the fear of it. But we're now more than capable of handling it. That's why it's coming up, is we're in a place where we can handle it. But we have to recognize that that's the fear of the child. It's not the fear of the adult now. And once we allow that fear and then are able to be with whatever that trauma was, then we're much more readily able to process it and complete that and take that load off. But it still doesn't make it all nicey. It's a challenging path, and it's something we want to be consistent on. To stay the course, there's a great value in regularity of practice and sensible daily routines so we can take care of ourselves. I mean, I've had a relatively sturdy body, and so I've not always taken good care of it, and so now that I'm getting older, it's starting to catch up to me. So I'm sort of a slow learner here. I'm gradually learning to be a little more proper and eat regular meals and so on. Yeah.
I would love to get your thoughts on the free will thing, David, because I think that's another subject that gets discussed a lot in Advaita.
Yeah, free will and determinism. Yeah, it's a really interesting one because it's basically comes down to perspective. Essentially, because there's an evolutionary path. those stages of development I talked a little briefly about early on, you know, we go from being a toddler to a tween and a teen and so on. Those stages in psychology, they also happen in the collective. And so and then people within the collective. So there's people who experience their life as being out of their control, and perhaps even they experience themselves as a victim, and that fate is fate is happening to them, and there's nothing they can do about it. Then there's people who experience life as kind of a mixture. They have some free will, and then there's some things that are fate, and then there's people who experience complete free will, like what I do, I'm in charge here. You know, what I do matters, and I'm going to make it happen, and I'm going to set goals, and I'm going to accomplish and be successful. And then you get people who, as you kind of go up the stages, who again experience, like for example with the witness, there's an experience of being the detached observer. So everything is still happening, but it's not me doing it. It's just happening. And then you find out later on, there's the potential to find out what's driving that bus. And so from that perspective, determinism is dominant. And then from a still higher stage, you wake up and you are the self from which all things arise. You are it's infinite free will, because you are the source, and you are the everything. And so on, and then go into further layers of that. And what it becomes clear at a certain point, they're both perspectives, and they're both true, and it just depends on which perspective you're in as to which is more prominent. And because from a sense of being cosmic self, you are the free will choice which determines what happens in your life, your individual life. So it's like the cosmic free will causes the personal determinism, or inversely, the personal free will causes cosmic determinism. It causes consequences. So yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. So yeah, but it's I mean, I've taken it pretty seriously at certain points in my life, but over time it's become more and more clear that it's just a perspective, and neither is absolute. They're both relative to your experience. And so broadly, it's a mixture. There are consequences to what we do, but it's sort of the actions of our free will choices of the past create our consequences in the present, and our free will choices in the present create our consequences in the future. So it's in a sense, from a time perspective, free will and determinism just depends on where you are on the time scale. The choice I had to say yes to your invitation to the interview will cause future consequences. Your choice to invite me led to my choice to accept, and then you have a consequence of actually doing the interview. I don't know, maybe that's not a great example, but it's sort of there's a number of ways of looking at the topic, but the key idea is that it's perspective, and if you understand that it's perspective, then you know that perspective can change. We're not victims, and nor are we as individuals in absolute control. It's a balancing act, and it's still very important to take responsibility for our life, and this idea that we have we're a victim and stuff. Then it can be an easy choice if we feel we don't want to take responsibility for the consequences of our action or for what we're doing. But it's important that we act ethically, and that there are consequences. And it's foolish to think that the world's an illusion, so it doesn't matter what I do. That's just going to cause you a lot of trouble. Maybe not right away. If it doesn't give you trouble right away, that's actually a sign that there's a bit of a backlog, and you've got a lot to that's coming at some point. And what goes around comes around. It's I've had to be patient about that sometimes, because sometimes I felt that somebody deserved more consequences, but I've experienced it myself, so I remind myself that they'll come.
Yeah, that's another one. I feel that concept gets carried on by some of these teachers, where they hear from a speaker saying that there is no free will. And sometimes I'm not sure if that is really their experience, or they are just saying because their teacher is saying that there is no free will. And maybe that teacher's experience was like that. Maybe
Yeah.
they felt like there is no free will, but that doesn't mean that's true for everybody else. That was that person's experience.
Yeah, but there's a lot of things that are like that, and it depends on how you're framing it. Like some spiritual teachers say, there's no person here. But what do they mean by the person? Are they referring to the ego that was identified before, that's now, or the asmita value, the possessive self? That is gone. We do lose our possessive self. But is there not, if you stub your toe, you're still going to have a reaction, and the idea that you don't have a person, kind of, it's tricky, because then what you see is teachers that can get into problems, because they're denying their person, and so they're denying the consequences of their actions, and so then whatever they do goes, and you get the sort of, I'm beyond karma now, and I can, whatever I do is right, because it's all coming through from consciousness. That can create nasty blind spots. So yeah, I'm personally, there's still lots of purification going on, and in different layers. It seems to be, the deeper I go, the more I find. But it's also on the level of the collective too, because as you become more and more cosmic, then the collective is more and more you. And this is not just true, like the shift in consciousness is cosmic with the initial awakening. But then there's this very gradual process of everything else becoming cosmic, even the physical body itself gradually becoming cosmic. But because it's the most inertial, it's the heaviest, and it's the slowest to change, so it takes the longest. And generally speaking, in a typical human life of the current time, people don't live long enough to, most people anyways, don't live long enough to turn their body into light, essentially. And then it can be whatever you want it to be. You can move it anywhere with attention and so on like that. But in the meantime, most of us have to get in a car or a plane and take it somewhere. We might be able to move easily in consciousness, but the body hasn't caught up to that yet. But there's a progressive descent of the light going on in the collective and in some individuals, and it changes a lot in time.
And is that the flow you mentioned earlier about head, heart, and gut?
That's kind of the way they frame it in the Kundalini tradition, is that the Shakti, the Shakti, or Kundalini Shakti, rises up to join Shiva in the crown, and then the two descend together. And there's kind of like, through the higher stages, there's a descent. And so head, and then when it meets the heart, and then when it meets the gut, and then when it meets the root, it's kind of like, I would associate it broadly with Brahman, but again, there's for that to happen, there's a purification that has to take place. But that's kind of like a post-awakening process in consciousness. But there's also a process in divinity that happens much later on, where we're essentially filled with light, and then that goes into all the cracks, and that can have a descent or a rise, and various kinds of things that can take place, and then it gets integrated on more and more levels. There isn't good documentation, and I found for the overall process. I mean, there's little bits and pieces, like people talk about the rainbow body in Tibetan Buddhism, and there's various kinds of things that talk about it in a general way, but I haven't seen well translated material that understands it, and it's awkward. There's some good I mean, the Yoga Vasishta is a remarkable text of the teachings of the sage Vasishta, who defined these 7 stages, and yet I'm yet to see a translation that translates them properly. One of them, I think, saw them as 7 places we might go after we die, rather than 7 stages of enlightenment. So it's kind of the understanding has not been fully restored yet, but the material is there. There's a lot. It's just beautiful what's been unfolding over time, and just this online resources, gives you access to all kinds of material to sift through. Sometimes really good resources.
Another thing it seems like that gets confused is emptiness and nothingness. Can you clarify the differences?
Yeah, it's quite interesting because like I mentioned earlier, we can have, with the awakening, we can experience a shift from being a personal me to being emptiness, or we can experience, a shift from being personal me to being fullness, and those are the same thing. They sound very different, and there could be a sense of ego death or a sense of ego expanding to become cosmic. Again, all the same thing. Now, language is a bit tricky because there isn't a lot of good words, especially in English, for some of this stuff. Sanskrit does much better, but even there, a lot of the words are used really broadly. Everything is Brahman, so people use Brahman for everything, for example. But essentially, consciousness becomes self-aware, and in that process of experience, it creates a kind of subtle space. Then everything that arises, that we experience, arises in that dynamic. And it's nested, which means there's spaces within spaces within spaces. And like our universe is in the first subspace, and that's really the first manifest space. And then every object we experience, including ourselves, has a kind of bubble of consciousness, sits in a kind of bubble of consciousness, self-interacting consciousness. And because it's all a point value aware of itself, which is what allows it to bring out the qualities and form and so on. That's a whole other conversation too. But space can be empty or full. It can be experienced as empty or full. But nothingness, the way I use it, is far beyond that. Brahman itself is inclusive of consciousness, but it's also beyond consciousness. And in that, like I mentioned earlier, it has a quality of nothingness because it's prior to consciousness, and everything arises within the dynamics of consciousness, all forms of experience, all forms and experience. And Brahman is prior to that, so that it's uncreated, and it's qualityless, and so it has a quality of nothingness. There's no thing there. So it's not empty because empty is a quality of space, and space is an effect of the dynamics of consciousness, aware of itself. It kind of creates a container, so to speak. And whereas emptiness is beyond that. And if you talk to someone who's self-realized or even in unity consciousness, they experience consciousness as being infinite and eternal. So the idea there's something beyond that is ridiculous to someone even in advanced unity. And yet, and there are people who talk of Brahman in terms of being the climax of unity, but it's actually a transcendence of unity. We wake up from consciousness, just like we wake up from being a person in self-realization. In the Brahman shift, we wake up from being consciousness, and that hasn't been that's been even less understood until recently. But it's not just the experience here. It's been the experience of many people that I've spoken to about it. There's similar patterns and stuff, and there can be various things. It's an interesting shift because you essentially have to give up your enlightenment to make the shift. And so some people kind of come to the edge of it and step back, and come to the edge of it and step back, and then they kind of step in. And some people just kind of go and fall in, and it's like, whoa, what was that? And so on. And not to be scary. It's not. That's kind of the initial shift. But then as it matures, we come to know what is there, and then that sets the stage for something that's even deeper, where we get into pure divinity itself. As I mentioned earlier, the source of the source, and that kind of brings everything together. Then you understand where consciousness comes from, and why the world's the way it is, and it's sort of all these subtle dynamics within Brahman that are non-expressed and in the nothingness. But yeah, the words get messy and misleading when you're talking about this stuff. But it's there's a deep richness in there. Like the light of consciousness is actually the light of divinity shining through the veil of consciousness. There's this quality they call, in Sanskrit, quality of consciousness, they call chandas, which basically means covering. It has this quality of covering. In the West, we often use the term veil. And so there's kind of like our physical reality, when tamas is dominant and we experience the world as real, it serves as a veil over our more subtle nature, more subtle layers. But as that thins a little bit and we become more conscious of the subtle layers, then the noise of the emotions in the mind can become like veils. And then that covering is seen through. And then until we get right down into the dynamics of consciousness, and then eventually even the covering of consciousness is seen through, so we can discover Brahman. And I don't know, Brahman doesn't really work as a veil. It doesn't really have that quality because it's a quality of consciousness. Shantas is quality of consciousness. But it's so profoundly subtle that and abstract that it takes a deep, deep subtleness to go into those deep, deep places, and to be able to see them. And it's interesting because you sort of say, well, the Brahman shift and it's beyond consciousness, beyond any experience. So how can you know Brahman then? There's nothing to experience it with. Well, it turns out that the mechanics is that Brahman knows Brahman, and you are it. And so when you are it, you can recognize that. And then the same thing with beyond that, with what's called para-Brahman or pure divinity, that knows itself. But in order to know it, you have to be it, or recognize you are it. And it's the same with consciousness. If you want to know consciousness, you need to recognize you are it.
It's very interesting because that first shift is so simple and ordinary. There can be a reluctance to think that it may be easily misunderstood as like,
oh yeah,
as a
yeah.
mind.
Some people experience waking up as like falling over backwards off a cliff, because you're letting go of this anchor you've had, this sense of self, and falling into the unknown. But actually, it's not. It's that letting go. It's the ego that's afraid. It's quite interesting actually, because there can be these dynamics in the approach to awakening, where you become increasingly conscious of the ego and its machinations, and you realize that you're not that because you're experiencing it. It's like you're not the mind because it's an object in your experience. You can experience the mind. You're not the emotions because you can experience them. You're not the body because it's an object of your experience. But as you go in more and more subtle, in the other direction, you go back and you realize that you can see the ego dynamics going on. And in my case, the ego used memories of spiritual experiences to pretend to be spiritual and create conflict to distract me, because it felt it needed to stay in control. that it needed to be in charge to be safe. And so letting go was not safe. Letting go was dangerous, you know, but eventually I just realized it was just ego machinations. Ugh, I'm not pronouncing that right. And so I was able to see through it more deeply. And essentially all it took was the self, consciousness itself, just had to become loud enough. And it overshadowed all that. And then the seeing could happen.
Thank you so much, David. I think we have kind of laid out a nice map in this conversation.
Okay. Yeah, we didn't go through the stages in any kind of systematic way, but if people are interested, they can certainly come to my website where I do talk about it.
Did you want to, if you want, you can briefly talk about each stage. I would love to listen.
Okay. Just for a brief context. So essentially, the first thing that's normally added is known as samadhi, or in the Upanishads call it turiya, meaning the fourth. It's essentially a fourth state of consciousness, waking, dreaming, and sleeping. And then through meditation and similar practices, we add samadhi, which is a form of restful alertness, where we're awake inside and the body is deeply restful. So it's like sleep in the sense of rest, but it's like waking state in the sense of being alert. And that kind of adds this quality that cultures our inner nature and makes us more and more conscious over time of our self within. So then at a certain point, that becomes strong enough that it wakes up to itself through us. The ego identification drops away, and the asmita, the possessive self, falls away, and we shift to being cosmic consciousness, or we can become self-realized, because consciousness is the cosmic self, the Atman quality. The next stage in consciousness is when we shift, as I mentioned, into unity or oneness, where we recognize that the consciousness within is also what's underlying the world around us. It's like the screen, as I mentioned, the screen of the world that the world is playing out on is also consciousness, and that is myself. So there's a recognition, and it's the intellect that discriminates that. The intellect was formerly associated with the mind and being tossed around by the mind, but after we wake up, it becomes associated with our inner consciousness or inner being, and becomes much more stable and reliable. And then it becomes a tool for the next shift. And then unity itself tends to unfold in a series of stages, because there's a lot in the world. And so there's this progressive, looking at something, oh, that's self, that is myself also, and oh, that is myself also. And the Brahma Sutra calls it the aggregate. Basically, the wholeness basically gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And all these layers of experience and memory and all this stuff gradually gets added into that. And so it tends to unfold in stages. And then at a certain point, there's a number of ways how this might unfold, but at a certain point, consciousness comes to know itself globally and at every point within itself. So it kind of knows itself fully. And there's an interesting thing that can then happen, and this can be more or less conscious, but essentially it's been looking in on itself the whole time. There was that conscious aware of itself thing. It's been looking in on itself the whole time. And then when it knows itself fully, it kind of steps back and turns around, looks behind itself. And then it realizes Brahman, the nothing, that which is beyond consciousness, the great. Brahman means the great. It's called the Supreme Awakening in some of the texts. And then there's an integration process there. And then we have to kind of go back to the beginning a little bit to bring the other side of it in. That's kind of the masculine process. And then the feminine process is the refinement of perception and the awakening heart. And so after the initial awakening, if there's a refinement process going on, and that needs to be taking place, and sometimes that's not there, depends on both development of consciousness and development of refinement or sattva are cumulative through lifetimes. So when we come into this lifetime, we pick up where we left off. So each person has a different level of development in each of them. Some of them are strong here, but weaker there. Some of them are the other way around, and so on. that's a whole other conversation. So there's the feminine process. And so after there's the awakening and we realize we're not the doer, the question can come up, so what's doing the doing? And with the refinement of perception, we start to be able to experience the fine laws of nature or deva values of the world around us. And there's this unfolding of a recognition of the mechanics of the world that we live in, and how rich it is with life. Not just the life we're aware of, but all those cellular levels going down also have life in them. And as a friend observed yesterday, they have actually more life the further down you go. And then there's this heart awakening, where there's the initial heart awakening during the rise towards awakening, but then there's the descent to the heart with Shiva and Shakti together, and it's like a higher octave of the heart opens up that's more universal, and so it becomes like a fire hose of love, so to speak. I talked about at the time. It's like just you become this flow of love, and that progresses the process. And then after the unity shift, there's a refined unity stage where that same refinement process going on post awakening progresses, but now in the context of unity. And then there's another stage with Brahman in the same way. Although it's quite a different quality, because it's what do you refine when there's no quality of experience. That's a whole other thing. But it requires this refinement process to get to the seventh stage, and that's when the two kind of come together in para-Brahman or pure divinity. And yeah, there's not a lot that can be said about that except that it's divinity itself. The way pure consciousness is kind of like, you think about when we're meditating, we experience pure consciousness within. Consciousness without any qualities. It's just awareness. It's just there. And in that refinement process, we can recognize the intelligence and the organizing power of divinity in form and in qualities and so on like that. But pure divinity is just divinity by itself, unexpressed, but pure divinity. And then we can recognize that all those qualities we talked about earlier and so on, and the qualities that make up consciousness all originated with divinity. So that's kind of the seventh stage. And then of course there's, for all the stages, there's the process of integration and refinement and getting grounded in that stage and then living it. Because that's the point of this stuff, is not to reach some goal, but to actually to live it.
And some of these refinements, they may not be like very blissful. They may, because you see a lot of details, and it may not be like, sometimes it can be challenging to integrate.
Yeah, the refinement process isn't as challenging that way. It's more the purification process that's challenging. I mentioned earlier about some of the experiences I had were challenging, but it was the me that was challenged by them, because I wanted answers and I wanted to know. The me wanted to know and to understand, and that unfolded over time. I just was being impatient, essentially. So it's the me that created the challenges there, and but the refinement itself is really rich and full. And we can experience emotions in a way we never experienced them before, just much bigger, fuller. Enlightenment isn't an absence of emotion, it's liberated emotions. Everything gets liberated, and it's quite remarkable, just the richness that can come to life through that. Yeah, so it's not refinement itself is actually kind of delightful. It can be distracting, though. It's not. You have to always keep in mind that you want source. You want the two together. It's the consciousness that grounds the refinement, because without the consciousness, without that stable inner platform, then we can get tossed around by refinement, just like any other experience. But with that refinement, then it's nothing but a benefit.
Sorry, I used incorrect word. I meant to say purification.
Yes. Okay, that's fine. But just to make sure that's understood by listeners.
And it seems like the refinements can happen even before the shifts
Oh,
happen.
yes. Yes, it really varies. For some people, it starts long before. Some people start having it in early childhood and then lose it during their school years, because the mind is cultured and made more dominant. And then after they get established in a spiritual practice, it starts to come back again. It really varies a lot. And some people, it starts much later in the process. I know someone, for example, whose heart woke up after the Brahman shift, rather than after self-realization, just as an example. There's all kinds of variations in how that unfolds.
Do you think sometimes, like, if the refinement opens up before the shift, sometimes it can come through the filter of the ego? And
yeah, for some people, it can reinforce their specialness and identification with qualities of experience. And that can be tricky, but everybody has their challenges. I mean, I've got a strong mind. And so, I had a teacher jokingly tell me I was going to analyze my way to enlightenment back in the day. And I used to think it was something I had to get rid of. It's mind is bad and ego is bad, get rid of those things. And realized that, in time, it wasn't that they were bad. They were actually, that nature was innate here. And even in the midst of profound experiences, the intellect was in there like, oh, what's this? And so it's innate. And so the key was dropping the identification. So dropping the identification with those fancy experiences. They're not who you are. It's just what it's unfolding. And for here, I came to realize in time that I was having those early experiences because I'm on kind of a training program, and they had to start early to get it all in. And so kind of the easiest way to explain it, but because creation's a really big place. And it takes a long time for a human mind to process all this stuff.
I also didn't, I just remembered I didn't ask you about the laws of nature. How does that fit in with this unfoldment process?
Okay. Well, there's an interesting point that's useful to make. Again, it relates closely to the masculine and feminine aspect. It's the intellect and the heart. They're kind of, they can be used, and this is the stable intellect, they can be used as vehicles or modes of knowing. So we might call that intellect and intuition, seeing with the mind, seeing with the heart. There's a lot of ways people frame the two. But essentially, the refinement of perception can unfold through the impersonal process, where we see the mechanics of the laws of nature and how the energy interacts and the subtle structures and vibration and all these dynamics on an impersonal way and an analytical kind of way. And then the other mode is the personal, and essentially the personal is seeing with the heart, and this is personified. So those laws of nature are seen as having forms. Deva is the term, which essentially means light being, or being, someone made of light instead of being made of matter, like ourselves. And we also have light bodies, but that's a whole other story. And so there's the potential to interact with the laws of nature, like to have a conversation with the wind. I sometimes use the example of a plane ride I was on, and we moved into a very windy area, and the plane got quite roller coastery, lift and bump and lift and bump. And so I tuned into the wind devas in the area, and I asked them if they would be willing to move off to another area, and their response was, "We're just doing our jobs, don't bug me," kind of a thing. And so then I put the attention on their managers, so to speak, the laws of nature and hierarchies, and asked them if he could move the storm. Oh yeah, no problem. And he got and moved them off, and the plane settled and had a smooth ride for the rest of the trip. So it's very practical. A friend of mine had a big problem with a huge flock of robins that decided to hang out in his backyard and were crapping on everything and making a mess. And so he communicated with the deva that was responsible for the robins, and they moved into the nearby canyon where they weren't going to cause any problems. So it can be very practical on that level, but it's also way too much information for day-to-day life when you're trying to, focus on something and get something done. If you're noticing the deva of the paper and what's going on in the what the light's doing, and how your plant is being nurtured, and all these different things, it gets way too much information. So it's for the most of the time, being in the impersonal mode is the most useful way to function, at least for this person, this body mind. But that's available, and can be very valuable for specific kinds of understanding. And there are ancient sages that are still with us, and great beings of yore that are still available to but of course it's a relationship thing, so you have to be appropriate and respectful and stuff. And a lot of the local laws of nature that are dealing with the plants around us and so on, our furniture and that, don't have high regard for humans because they're disrespectful and don't acknowledge them, and so they don't tend to be respectful back either. But if you can create a relationship, it depends though. Some of them have more attitude than others. I remember a friend of mine bought a property in a new subdivision, and it's interesting too, because when you create abstract things, they have devas, and so like property is not a physical thing. It's a virtual, lines on the ground kind of thing. A property isn't really a thing; it's a concept essentially. But it's something that people recognize and hold as you can purchase property and so on, and the property has a deva, and this particular landscape, the subdivision was done sloppily without respect, and so the devas had attitude, and so I anticipated there would be some interesting challenges with the construction. And so there are in the Vedic tradition has guidelines for proper ways to it's called vastu, proper ways to set up a property and to build a house and orient a house and so on like that, to make maximum benefit of the laws of nature and to have them supportive, as opposed to being creating any kind of conflicts with nature. So all those things are potentialities through the refinement of perception. Become aware of those kinds of things. But some people have, much better skills than others. Dorothy Rowe, for example, is an energy healer, and she spends a lot of time working on certain levels to help with energy healing. And so she's become a lot more aware of details in there than I have, where I've kind of put a lot more attention on fundamental structures and how the world comes out of consciousness. And so I'm more aware of the details on those more subtle levels. And everybody is different. Everybody has a different orientation. Like I talked about earlier, we're all specific points with a specific perspective. But it's useful to recognize there's two modes, and we can shift from head to heart and as required. It's kind of like shifting focus, and it brings out different details in our experience.
And there may be resonance for different things for different people. Some may be more drawn towards nature.
Yes, nature itself is richer with laws of nature. So it's and they're self-support. They're not self-supporting is the wrong word. They're interrelating and not as opposed to laws of nature in someone's house where they're ignored and that where they don't get the same support. But one little comment on that, just an aside. One of the things that transcendence does, samadhi we were talking about earlier, that sets the stage for enlightenment, is it in the body. The human physiology has a unique skill, isn't the right word, ability. essentially at a very subtle level, there's this what might be called a white ocean of the substance called Soma or Admrita. It's a very fine substance, and the human physiology has a unique ability to refine that Soma and make it available. And it's referred to as the nectar of the gods and the fountain of youth and various things. But people have thought it's something out there. It's a plant. It's a literal fountain. It's a that kind of thing. But it's actually inside. And essentially, the ninth mandala of the Rig Veda talks about flow Soma through the filter, and there's various symbolic language in there. But it's actually we are the filter, and so we have that ability. And after we are clearly awake, it's a more ongoing thing, and that dramatically helps with the shift to sattva and the refinement taking place in the physiology and the migration, and the ability thus to not only to perceive this kind of stuff, these kind of nature in a personal way like that, but also it feeds them, particularly the devas in our physiology. But as we become more and more cosmic, our body becomes more and more cosmic, and so the world is our physiology, and so we're helping to feed the world, so to speak. It upgrades our nature support as well. There's an idea in the Indian tradition about when we have a good relationship with nature is and we're able to support nature is able to support us. So it means we can be more successful, accomplish things more smoothly. If karma is going to show up, they can help. Difficult karma, they can help it show up in a way that's less challenging and so on like that. And so it's very valuable to not to make a mood or imagination about this and start talking to your walls or anything. I'm just talking here about potentiality and what can unfold in the culturing and some of the value. There have been times in the world where this is the kind of things that I talk about have been much more common, and quality of life was much higher. And when we're moving towards that again now.
Are some of these things as simple as dropping the mental conditioning?
Well, yeah, but that's simple but harder to do because you're in the mental conditioning. When you're in it, it's harder to let it go. It's like when you're sitting on the chair, how do you let the chair go? It's much easier to let go when you step out of the chair. You stand up. So that's the value of spiritual practices, because they soften those bindings, and then we're able to stand up, and then we're able to let go of the chair. And it doesn't mean the chair necessarily goes away, but it just becomes a tool for us rather than who we are. It's like our body mind doesn't go away, but it becomes a vehicle for our expression rather than who we are. And we can value it in a very deep way because it has certain skills and abilities that we all have gifts, but sometimes it's very challenging to discover them when we're caught up in our old stories and dramas that haven't been resolved.
Thank you so much, David. I think you were able to shed some clarity on a lot of these things. Is there anything else do you think I missed we should have talked about?
Well, the only thing I would mention that's good to understand ties in with what I was just mentioning. One of the things that's going on in the world right now is that consciousness as a whole is rising. And when consciousness rises, we're all expressions of consciousness, so all boats are lifted. When the water rises, all boats rise. And what that's doing is it's bringing stuff to the surface for a lot of people that in greater amount than it was before. And it's a beautiful time, opportunity to do a lot of healing. But a lot of people don't understand that's what's going on. they're seeing it more like the world's falling apart, or there's these endless problems. And but what it's actually is a symptom of healing going on, a collective healing. And if we understand that process and we cooperate with it, it can be very productive for us. But if we see it as this, nasty drama that we want to avoid, then we're getting in the way of that process, and it's going to make this process much more challenging for us. And so it is very valuable to learn those basic principles of energy healing in the sense of being aware of how we're feeling and when we're being reactive. And the mind can name those feelings. It can help make them more conscious. But the mind can't process the feelings. We have to go into the emotions to actually feel them, not to be in them in the sense of stepping inside them, but in the emotional body to experience them. So if we have some value of presence, from spiritual practice that's been cultured, and we're able to just be present with them, not in them, but just observe them and notice them and allow them, then they can heal. And it doesn't mean spending 6 hours a day sitting there. What am I feeling now? It's just when you're going through life and you notice there's some reactivity going on, and something, an excessive reaction to something, or kind of agitation about something, or whatever that's going on in your life, to stop for a moment if you can in that moment and just feel that. What is it that you're feeling? And and can you give it a name? It may not be important to give it a name. If your emotions are clear to you, naming doesn't matter. And just, can you feel it? And can you be with that for a moment? And in many cases, all it takes is just to be with it for a moment. There's a wave of emotion washes over you, and it's done. And then you can go on with your life. And that little piece of your load is done. So just to understand that we're just in a time. And for some people, this isn't going to be as much of a thing going on. But for lots of people, there's a lot of intensity right now. And there's certain, overt expressions of that in the world that we need to get into. But just to understand that we're in a beautiful opportunity for making progress. But that depends on how we're responding to it. And not to beat yourself up if you're imperfect about this. It's nobody's perfect. We all have our stuff. It's the whole thing here is about just allowing and letting go, and not being so much in the judge, not being so critical of others or ourselves. A little compassion.
That's a lovely message to end this video with. If someone wants to reach out to you, it's davidya.ca.
Yes, like the David, David, ya.ca. I'm Canadian, so Canadian domain. And yeah, there's I don't know, somewhere over 2,000 articles on the site. There's a media tab where a link where there shows interviews and other conversations I've had like this, and talks I've given. There's my book. You can see it on the right sidebar. There's the picture of the cover, if that's of interest. So you can access my content in various ways. And yeah, you're welcome to explore. I'm not just as a note though, I'm not a teacher in the sense of having students and that kind of stuff. I'm primarily a writer, and sharing the journey and my observations on the path.
Thank you. And I also want to quickly thank the listeners. If you like this content, please remember to like,